Tama's life was a picture of stability on the surface. At 29, she had a home, a loving husband, and a successful business venture she shared with her best friend, Rachel. Her husband, Rain, was a well-respected radiologist, 10 years her senior, and known for his kindness and generosity. He provided her with everything she could ever want: financial security, a comfortable home, and unwavering support. To anyone looking in from the outside, Tama was living the dream. But there was an emptiness inside her that she couldn't ignore. It wasn't that she didn't love Rain, she did, in her way. But over time, the spark in their marriage had faded, leaving her feeling unfulfilled. The age gap, which hadn't seemed like much of an issue when they first got married, now loomed larger than ever. At 39, Rain was settled in his ways, content with the quiet life they had built together. He preferred cozy nights at home and long conversations over dinner, while Tama's energy craved something more. Intimacy had become a routine, a mechanical part of their marriage that lacked the passion Tama desired. Rain, ever gentle and thoughtful, seemed unaware of the fire that had gone out between them. To him, everything was fine. He worked hard at his job, coming home late, tired but happy to be with her. He never noticed the moments when Tama turned away in bed, her body present but her mind wandering to thoughts she couldn't quite control. In her quieter moments, Tama wondered if it was her. Maybe she was asking for too much. Maybe what she wanted, what she craved, was something only found in stories or fleeting moments of passion that didn't last in real life. Rain was a good man. He loved her, he took care of her, and he never raised his voice or gave her any reason to doubt his loyalty. But that was the problem, wasn't it? He was too perfect, too steady. There was no excitement, no unpredictability, no raw emotion to set her pulse racing. She remembered a time, years ago, when she used to feel that rush of excitement around Rain. Back then, his maturity had been attractive to her, a sign of stability and security in a world that often felt chaotic. But now, the same thing she had admired about him felt like a cage. His predictability had become stifling, his routine dull. Tama found herself yearning for something more intense, something that would make her feel alive again. The realization that she was no longer satisfied with her marriage gnawed at her. She didn't want to hurt Rain, and she hated herself for even thinking about wanting more. But the dissatisfaction was there, bubbling beneath the surface, growing stronger with each passing day. Her business with Rachel had become her escape. What had started as a simple venture into men's clothing had blossomed into something successful, giving her a sense of purpose outside her marriage. It wasn't just the work that fulfilled her, it was the people she met through it. Men, like the customer who had caught her attention a few weeks ago. Axel, his name was. A regular customer, fit and attractive, whose casual charm had stirred something in her that she hadn't felt in a long time. Axel wasn't anything special, at least not in the way Rain was. He didn't have Rain's intelligence, nor his calm demeanor. But he had something else, an energy that Tama couldn't quite explain. Something raw, physical, and exciting. When he came into the shop, she found herself drawn to him in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. She knew it was dangerous, this attraction. She knew it was wrong to feel this way while married to a man like Rain. And yet, the excitement was intoxicating. For the first time in years, she felt like she was waking up from a long sleep. Tama tried to push the feelings aside, to tell herself that it was nothing more than harmless curiosity. But the thoughts of Axel lingered, especially during the quiet moments when Rain was away at work and she was alone in their big house. The fantasies played out in her mind, what it would feel like to be with someone like Axel, someone who could make her feel things she hadn't felt in years. She tried to shake the thoughts, but the more she resisted, the stronger they became. And so, the rift between her and Rain grew wider. He, ever the devoted husband, had no idea what was happening inside her. He still looked at her with the same loving eyes, still tried to engage her in conversation over dinner, still kissed her goodnight. But Tama felt herself drifting further away, trapped between the life she had and the life she secretly craved. She wasn't sure how much longer she could pretend everything was fine. Something had to change. Tama's escape from the routine of her marriage came in the form of the business she had started with her best friend, Rachel. The idea had started as a casual conversation over drinks one night. Rachel, ever the free spirit, had been dabbling in small business ideas for years. Tama had always admired Rachel's ambition and her willingness to take risks, something Tama had never quite managed in her own life. But when the idea of starting a male clothing business came up, something clicked. Tama felt an excitement she hadn't felt in a long time, and before she knew it, they were partners in a venture that would eventually consume more of her time and energy than she had expected. The business took off faster than either of them anticipated. What had started as an online shop quickly grew into a physical store, and soon they were catering to a wide range of customers. Tama threw herself into the work. It wasn't just a distraction from her growing dissatisfaction with Rain, it became her outlet. The world of male fashion was exciting, vibrant, and full of new experiences. She felt independent, alive, and in control, something she hadn't felt in her marriage for a long time. Rain had been supportive at first. He was proud of her success, always telling their friends and family about how well the business was doing. He'd even helped her with some of the initial startup costs, believing that it would be a good project for her. But as the business grew, so did the time Tama spent away from home. She was constantly at the store, working late nights, attending meetings, and building relationships with clients. It wasn't long before Rain started to feel uneasy. He had never been particularly interested in fashion, let alone men's fashion, but it wasn't the business itself that bothered him. It was the world Tama was becoming a part of. The men who came into her store were different from the crowd Rain was used to, more fashionable, confident, and often flirtatious. He couldn't help but notice the way some of them looked at Tama, and it didn't sit right with him. He trusted his wife, of course, but the thought of her being surrounded by so many attractive men made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite explain. Tama noticed Rain's unease, but brushed it off as nothing. She told herself that he was just being overprotective, that he didn't understand the fashion world the way she did. But deep down, she knew there was more to it. The truth was, the business gave her something that her marriage didn't: independence. It allowed her to explore parts of herself that had been dormant for years. She thrived in that environment, soaking up the attention and the thrill of creating something on her own. And then there was Axel. Axel was one of their regular customers, a man who seemed to walk into her store just to chat with her. He was tall, fit, with an easy smile and a confidence that was hard to ignore. The first time they met, Tama had been struck by his energy, the way he carried himself like he owned every room he walked into. It wasn't just his physical appearance, though that certainly caught her attention, it was the way he talked to her, as if they were the only two people in the room. Their conversation started innocently enough, talking about clothes, about the latest trends in men's fashion. But there was always something beneath the surface, something unspoken that hung in the air between them. Axel would make a joke, his eyes lingering on her a little too long, and Tama would feel a thrill rush through her that she hadn't felt in years. It was exhilarating and dangerous. The more Axel came into the store, the more Tama found herself looking forward to his visits. She told herself it was harmless, that it was just a bit of fun, something to brighten her day. But there was a part of her that knew it was more than that. Axel represented everything she had been missing in her marriage: excitement, passion, unpredictability. Rain was stable, dependable, but Axel made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt since she was younger. Rachel, ever the observant friend, noticed the way Tama's eyes would light up when Axel was around. She teased her about it, but never took it seriously. "It's good for business," Rachel would say with a wink, flirting never hurt anyone. But for Tama, it wasn't just flirting. It was a spark that had been missing from her life for far too long. Rain, meanwhile, started to sense the distance growing between them. He wasn't oblivious to the fact that Tama was spending more time at the store and less time at home. The late nights, the constant meetings, the endless conversations about work, he could feel her slipping away. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew that the business, the very thing he had supported her in building, was becoming a wedge between them. One night, as they sat down for dinner, Rain brought it up. You've been spending a lot of time at the store lately, he said, his tone casual but with an edge of concern. Is everything okay? Tama glanced up from her plate, surprised by the question. Of course, she replied, trying to sound nonchalant. The business is growing, there's just a lot to do. You know how it is. Rain nodded, but he didn't look convinced. I know you're busy, and I'm proud of what you've built, but I just feel like we've been drifting apart lately. The comment caught Tama off guard. She hadn't expected him to notice, let alone say something. For a moment, she felt a pang of guilt. He was right, they were drifting apart. But she didn't know how to fix it. The excitement she found at work, the thrill of building something new, was too intoxicating. And then there was Axel. We're not drifting apart, she said, forcing a smile. It's just a business. Things will settle down soon. Rain didn't press the issue, but Tama could see the doubt in his eyes. She tried to push the guilt away, but it lingered, like a shadow that followed her everywhere she went. She knew she should be more present in their marriage, that she should make an effort to reconnect with Rain. But every time she thought about it, the image of Axel popped into her mind, and the thrill of what could be overshadowed what was. The business continued to grow, and with it, Tama's sense of independence. She started spending more time away from home, justifying it as necessary for the success of the store. But the truth was, she was starting to feel more alive at work than she did in her marriage. The store gave her freedom, excitement, and a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in years. And Axel was always there, a reminder of the fire she had once felt, and the possibility of reigniting it. Tama knew she was walking a dangerous line, but she wasn't ready to step back yet. The thrill was too strong, and the dissatisfaction with her marriage too deep. She told herself that she could handle it, that it was just harmless fun. But deep down, she knew that something had to give. Tama had always enjoyed meeting new customers. It was part of what made her business venture so exciting, building relationships with people, helping them find the perfect look. But the first time she met Axel in person, it was different. There was something about him that instantly grabbed her attention, a presence that made her feel more alive than she had in a long time. She had interacted with Axel a few times online. He'd bought clothes from their store before, always polite, always appreciative of the personal touch she brought to her business. But nothing prepared her for the jolt of electricity she felt when he walked into her shop that day. It was a busy afternoon. Tama was sorting through the new arrivals, adjusting the displays while Rachel handled the front. She barely noticed the sound of the doorbell ringing as Axel entered, his towering figure casting a shadow over the counter. Rachel greeted him with a warm smile, not recognizing him immediately. It was when he mentioned his name that Tama looked up, her hands freezing mid-motion. Axel was more striking in person than she had imagined. Tall, muscular, with a chiseled jawline and dark, intense eyes that seemed to hold an unspoken confidence. He was dressed casually, jeans, a leather jacket, and a crisp white shirt, but the way he carried himself made him stand out. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, but he didn't need to. He exuded a natural charisma, something primal and magnetic that instantly drew people to him. And in that moment, he had Tama's full attention. Tama tried to stay professional, reminding herself that he was just a customer, but the attraction was immediate. She could feel it in the way her pulse quickened when he smiled, the way her heart raced when their eyes met. It was like being struck by lightning, completely unexpected, and entirely out of her control. Rachel, ever the social butterfly, chatted easily with Axel, discussing his previous orders and offering suggestions for new styles. But Tama was only half listening. Her mind was racing, replaying their brief online interactions and comparing them to the man standing in front of her now. He had been charming enough over messages, but seeing him in person was something else entirely. There was a quiet confidence in the way he moved, in the way he spoke, that made it hard for her to look away. Finally, Rachel nudged Tama, pulling her out of her thoughts. "Hey, Tama," she said with a playful smile, "why don't you help Axel pick out a few new pieces? You know his style better than anyone." Tama blinked, realizing she had been staring a little too long. She forced a smile, trying to regain her composure. Of course, she said, stepping forward to take the reins. What are you looking for today, Axel? He turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers in a way that made her stomach flutter. Something new, he said, his voice deep and smooth. Something that stands out. The way he said it felt like it carried a double meaning, but Tama pushed the thought away, focusing on the task at hand. She guided him through the store, picking out a few jackets, shirts, and accessories that she thought would suit him. But every time she handed him something, their fingers would brush, sending a spark of electricity through her body. She could feel his presence behind her as they moved through the aisles, close enough to sense the warmth of his body. They talked casually, discussing fashion, business, and small details about their lives. Axel was easy to talk to, his voice calm, his demeanor relaxed. He wasn't like the other customers who came into the store, eager to impress or make small talk. There was a subtle confidence in the way he carried himself, an unspoken understanding that he didn't need to try to get attention. It just came naturally. Tama found herself laughing at his jokes, feeling a lightness she hadn't felt in a while. It was refreshing, being around someone so different from Rain, someone who wasn't weighed down by the seriousness of life, who could make her feel seen in a way that Rain hadn't in years. She didn't want to admit it, but there was an undeniable chemistry between them, something that went beyond the professional boundaries of customer and business owner. Axel's compliments were subtle but effective. He didn't shower her with praise, but every now and then, he would say something that made her blush, a comment about how her style was impeccable, how she had an eye for what worked. And then there was the way he looked at her, his eyes lingering just a second too long, as if he saw her in a way that no one else did. Tama tried to push the feelings aside, reminding herself that this was just business. But as the afternoon went on, she found it harder to ignore the growing tension between them. It wasn't just the casual flirting or the compliments, it was the way Axel seemed to understand her without needing to say much. The way his presence made her heart race and her mind wander to places it shouldn't. Eventually, Axel picked out a few items to try on, and Tama led him to the fitting room. She stood just outside, leaning against the counter as he tried on the clothes she had chosen. Her mind was spinning, replaying every interaction they'd had, trying to make sense of the connection she felt with him. When Axel stepped out of the fitting room, wearing one of the jackets she had picked, Tama's breath caught in her throat. He looked even better than she had imagined, the jacket hugging his broad shoulders perfectly, his confident smile making her heart skip a beat. "What do you think?" Axel asked, his voice low and smooth. Tama forced herself to focus, her eyes quickly scanning the fit of the jacket. "It looks great," she said, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "You've got the perfect build for it." Axel's smile widened, and he took a step closer. "I think you've got an eye for what works," he said, his gaze locking onto hers. "You know me better than I thought." Tama's heart raced as he stood there, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. For a moment, neither of them said anything, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. Tama felt her pulse quicken, her mind torn between her loyalty to Rain and the undeniable attraction she felt toward Axel. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, to break the tension, but Axel spoke first. "You're different from other people I've met," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "There's something about you." Tama swallowed hard, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She knew she should say something, should step back, should stop whatever this was before it went too far. But the thrill of being seen, of being desired in a way she hadn't felt in years, was intoxicating. She couldn't help but feel drawn to Axel, like a moth to a flame. "I'm just doing my job," she said, trying to keep her tone light, but the words felt hollow even as she said them. Axel tilted his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "Maybe," he said. "But I think there's more to it than that." The moment stretched on, the tension between them palpable. Tama knew she was playing with fire, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't care. The excitement, the danger, the possibility of something new, it was all too tempting to resist. As Axel gathered his things and prepared to leave, he flashed her one last smile, one that left her heart racing long after he was gone. "I'll be back soon," he said, his voice low and filled with promise. Tama watched him walk out of the store, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She knew this was the beginning of something dangerous, something she couldn't control. But as the door closed behind him, she realized that a part of her didn't want to stop it. In the days following her encounter with Axel, Tama couldn't shake the thoughts of him from her mind. She tried to keep herself busy, throwing herself into her work at the store and spending time with Rachel, but no matter what she did, Axel's presence lingered. It wasn't just his looks or his confidence, though both had certainly made an impact. It was the way he had made her feel. Seen. Desired. Alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. The excitement was intoxicating, and the temptation gnawed at her, quietly whispering that there could be something more if she just let go. At home, the distance between her and Rain grew even more noticeable. Rain, ever the devoted husband, still treated her with the same gentle affection he always had, but it only made Tama feel more guilty. She didn't deserve his kindness, not when her mind was elsewhere, imagining what it would be like to be with Axel. The guilt twisted inside her, but so did the temptation, creating a storm of conflicting emotions that Tama couldn't untangle. Their intimate life, which had once been a cornerstone of their relationship, now felt like a chore. When Rain touched her, she found herself comparing him to Axel, wondering how it would feel if it were Axel's hands on her body instead. Every kiss felt hollow, every embrace felt distant. She couldn't bring herself to be present with Rain anymore, not when her mind was consumed by thoughts of another man. Rain, of course, didn't notice the shift. He was too busy with his demanding job, too tired to see the signs that something was wrong. Tama hated herself for it. Rain didn't deserve to be lied to, and she knew that. He had always been good to her, patient, loving, supportive. But that was part of the problem. He was too good, too predictable. Their life together had become routine, and the spark that had once excited her about their relationship was now nothing more than a faint ember. Rain's dependability, the very thing she had once found comforting, now felt stifling. She found herself avoiding him more and more. Work became her excuse, the store a convenient escape from the growing tension at home. She started staying late, telling Rain that there were orders to fill or that she needed to catch up on paperwork. In reality, she was spending those extra hours thinking about Axel, wondering when he would walk through the door again, wondering if he was thinking about her, too. And then, one afternoon, he did. It was a slow day at the shop. Rachel was out running errands, leaving Tama alone to handle the few customers who trickled in. She was in the back, organizing some stock, when she heard the familiar sound of the bell above the door. She didn't think much of it at first, just another customer, another sale to make. But when she walked out to the front, her breath caught in her throat. Axel was standing at the counter, looking as confident and magnetic as ever. He smiled when he saw her, that same easy smile that had left her heart racing the first time they met. His dark eyes lingered on her for a moment, and Tama felt her pulse quicken, her body reacting to his presence before she could stop it. "Back again so soon," she said, trying to sound casual, but her voice came out softer than she intended. Axel shrugged, his smile widening. "What can I say? I liked what I bought last time. Figured I'd come back for more." There was a playful undertone to his words, and Tama couldn't help but smile, even as she felt the tension build between them. She knew she was playing with fire, that this was dangerous territory. But the temptation was there, pulling her in, making her forget about everything else. She helped Axel browse the store, just like she had before, but this time, the air between them felt heavier, more charged. Every time their hands brushed, every time their eyes met, it felt like an unspoken promise hung between them, something that both thrilled and terrified her. She could feel her body reacting to him, the heat rising in her cheeks, the flutter in her chest. She knew she should step back, keep things professional, but she couldn't bring herself to pull away. As they moved through the store, talking about clothes, about his life, about nothing in particular, Tama found herself hanging on to every word. Axel had a way of making her feel like she was the only person in the room, like everything he said was meant just for her. It was intoxicating, and for the first time in a long time, Tama felt truly desired. Not in the gentle, loving way that Rain desired her, but in a way that was raw, urgent, and exciting. Eventually, Axel picked out a few items to try on, and Tama led him to the fitting rooms again. As he stepped inside, Tama leaned against the counter, her heart racing, her mind spinning with thoughts she knew she shouldn't be having. This was wrong. She knew it was wrong. But the pull was too strong to ignore. When Axel stepped out of the fitting room, wearing one of the shirts she had picked for him, Tama's breath caught in her throat again. He looked even better than before, the fabric hugging his body in all the right places. But it wasn't just the way he looked, it was the way he looked at her. His dark eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, the air between them thick with tension. "You've got a good eye," Axel said, his voice low and smooth. "I think you know exactly what works for me." There was something in his tone, something more than just a compliment about the clothes. Tama felt the heat rise in her cheeks, her pulse quickening as Axel took a step closer. "I just know fashion," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but the words felt flimsy even as she said them. Axel smiled, his gaze never leaving hers. "I think you know more than that." The tension between them was almost unbearable now, the line between professional and personal blurring with every second that passed. Tama's heart pounded in her chest, her mind screaming at her to pull away, to stop this before it went any further. But her body wasn't listening. Her body was drawn to him, aching for something she had denied herself for far too long. "I should ring these up for you," Tama said quickly, breaking the silence and stepping back toward the counter, trying to put some distance between them. But Axel wasn't ready to let the moment pass. He followed her to the counter, his presence close behind her, the warmth of his body sending shivers down her spine. When she turned to face him, he was right there, close enough that she could feel his breath on her skin. "You know," he said quietly, his voice low and deliberate, "you don't have to pretend with me." Tama swallowed hard, her heart racing as his words hung in the air between them. She knew what he was offering, what he was suggesting, and part of her wanted to run, back to the safety of her marriage, back to Rain, back to the life she had always known. But the other part of her, the part that had been craving something more, something exciting, couldn't resist. "I'm not pretending," she said softly, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. Axel smiled, his eyes dark and intense as he leaned in just a little closer, his lips brushing against her ear as he whispered, "I think you are." Tama's breath hitched, her body reacting to the closeness, the heat, the undeniable pull between them. She knew she should push him away, tell him to leave, end whatever this was before it went any further. But she couldn't. The temptation was too strong, the excitement too intoxicating. For a long moment, they stood there, the space between them shrinking with every passing second. Tama's heart raced, her mind torn between the loyalty she knew she owed to Rain and the desire she couldn't ignore. And in that moment, she knew this was just the beginning. The tension between Tama and Axel had been building for weeks. What had started as casual flirtation had quickly turned into something far more dangerous, something Tama could no longer pretend was harmless. Every time Axel came into the store, every time he flashed that easy, confident smile, Tama's resolve weakened a little more. It was as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing she shouldn't jump, but unable to resist the pull of the abyss. At home, the distance between her and Rain had grown wider than ever. He didn't ask many questions about her long hours at the store anymore, choosing instead to focus on his demanding job. Rain was exhausted most days, coming home late and barely having the energy to talk, let alone notice the changes in her. When they did talk, their conversations felt shallow, distant, like they were going through the motions of being a married couple without actually connecting. The spark that had once brought them together had fizzled into a dull routine, and Tama found herself growing more and more resentful. She hated the way she felt around Rain now, like she was living a double life, pretending to be the devoted wife while her mind wandered to thoughts of Axel. The guilt gnawed at her, but the desire for something more, something exciting, overshadowed it. She couldn't stop thinking about Axel, his smile, his voice, the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the room. And she craved that feeling, craved the intensity that had been missing from her life for so long. It was late one evening when the line between temptation and action finally blurred beyond recognition. The store had closed for the night, and Tama was tidying up, preparing to lock up and head home. Rachel had already left, leaving Tama alone with her thoughts, her mind swirling with images of Axel, as it often did these days. Just as she was about to lock the front door, the bell rang. Tama turned, her heart skipping a beat as she saw Axel standing there, his usual confident smile in place. "Late night?" he asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Tama forced a smile, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened at the sight of him. "Yeah, just finishing up," she said, her voice a little too casual. Axel glanced around the empty store, his dark eyes settling on her. "Looks like I caught you at the perfect time," he said, his tone light, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something heavier. Tama's heart raced as she locked the door behind him, the click of the lock sounding louder than usual in the quiet shop. She turned to face Axel, trying to keep her expression neutral, but the air between them was thick with tension, the kind that made it impossible to ignore what was about to happen. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been thinking about you," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Tama swallowed hard, her body reacting to the heat in his gaze. "You shouldn't," she whispered, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew she didn't mean them. Axel's smile widened, and he took another step closer, closing the distance between them. "And yet, here I am," he said softly, his voice sending a shiver down her spine. Tama's breath caught in her throat as he stood before her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Her mind screamed at her to stop this, to push him away and walk out the door, but her body betrayed her. The desire, the temptation, it was too strong, too intoxicating to resist. She had spent weeks fighting it, convincing herself that it was nothing more than a harmless fantasy, but now, standing in front of Axel, she couldn't lie to herself anymore. "I can't do this," she said quietly, but even as she said the words, she didn't move. Axel's hand reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch light but deliberate. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And in that moment, Tama gave in. She couldn't fight it anymore. The guilt, the fear, the consequences, they all faded into the background as Axel's lips met hers. It was electric, the kiss sending a jolt of adrenaline through her body. Her mind went blank, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment, the rush of emotions she hadn't felt in so long. Axel's hands slid to her waist, pulling her closer, and Tama melted into him, her body responding to his touch in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. She had never been the type to take risks, to do something so reckless, but with Axel, all of her inhibitions disappeared. He made her feel alive, made her feel like the woman she had once been before the routine of her marriage had dulled her senses. For a moment, there was nothing but them, no rain, no marriage, no consequences. Just the heat of Axel's body against hers, the taste of his lips, the feel of his hands exploring her in a way that made her forget everything else. She knew it was wrong, knew that this was the point of no return, but she couldn't bring herself to care. Not when it felt this good, this freeing. They stumbled back toward the fitting rooms, their kisses growing more urgent, more intense with every step. Tama's mind swirled with a mixture of guilt and desire, but the desire won out. She didn't think about what this would mean for her marriage, didn't think about what would happen after. All she cared about in that moment was Axel and the way he made her feel. Inside the fitting room, the world outside ceased to exist. Axel's hands roamed her body, his touch igniting a fire inside her that she hadn't felt in years. It was like waking up from a long sleep, a rush of sensations that overwhelmed her and left her breathless. She had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted like this, to be consumed by passion. For the first time in a long time, Tama felt alive. And she didn't want it to end. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the small fitting room, the reality of what she had done began to creep in. The guilt hit her like a wave, crashing over her and pulling her under. She had crossed a line, one she could never uncross. There was no going back now. She had betrayed Rain, the man who had loved and supported her for years, the man who trusted her completely. Axel lay beside her, his arm draped casually over her waist, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. He didn't seem to share her guilt, didn't seem to be thinking about what this meant for her marriage. For him, this was just another conquest, another fleeting moment of passion. But for Tama, it was more than that. It was the beginning of the end. She sat up, pulling her clothes back on, her mind racing with a mixture of shame and confusion. How had she let it get this far? How had she allowed herself to give in to temptation, to risk everything she had built with Rain for a moment of excitement? Axel watched her, his expression calm, unreadable. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Tama nodded, but the knot in her stomach told a different story. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Axel didn't press her, didn't ask any more questions. He stood up, dressed himself, and gave her one last smile before heading for the door. "I'll see you around," he said, his tone casual, as if nothing had changed. But for Tama, everything had changed. As she watched him leave, the weight of what she had done settled heavily on her shoulders. She had crossed a line, one she couldn't take back, and now she would have to live with the consequences. The guilt gnawed at her, but there was no denying the thrill she had felt with Axel. It was exhilarating, intoxicating, but it came at a price. She stayed in the fitting room for a few more minutes, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. How would she face Rain now? How could she go home and pretend like nothing had happened? The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the desire to see Axel again. Tama knew this was only the beginning. After that night, everything changed for Tama. The line she had crossed with Axel marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one she wasn't sure she was ready for. What had started as a harmless flirtation had spiraled into something much more dangerous, something she couldn't easily walk away from. The guilt gnawed at her constantly, but so did the thrill. She had never been the type to take risks, to throw caution to the wind, but now, she was living a double life, one that was slowly consuming her. At home, things with Rain were as normal as ever, but for Tama, every interaction felt like a lie. Rain continued to be his usual, dependable self, going about his routine without any sign that he suspected something was wrong. He still came home late from work most nights, tired but happy to see her, and he still looked at her with the same love and trust he always had. But to Tama, his love now felt like a burden, a reminder of what she had betrayed. Every time Rain kissed her, she felt a wave of guilt crash over her. Every time he touched her, she was reminded of Axel's hands, of the way Axel made her feel alive in a way Rain hadn't in years. It became harder and harder to separate her life with Rain from her secret life with Axel. The two worlds were colliding, and Tama was at the center, struggling to keep everything from falling apart. Axel, for his part, made no secret of his intentions. He came back to the store regularly, his presence always sending a thrill through Tama's body. Every time he walked through the door, her pulse quickened, and she found herself pulled toward him, unable to resist the magnetic connection between them. He was bold, confident, and unapologetic about what they were doing. For him, it was simple, he wanted her, and he had her. But for Tama, it was much more complicated. She couldn't stop thinking about him, even when she was with Rain. Every moment they spent together, every secret encounter, only deepened her desire for him. Axel was everything Rain wasn't: wild, unpredictable, exciting. And yet, every time she left Axel's side, the weight of her betrayal bore down on her. She would drive home from the store, rehearsing what she would say to Rain, how she would act like nothing had happened, how she would hide the guilt that gnawed at her insides. Rain, oblivious to her inner turmoil, began to notice the distance between them. It wasn't something he could pinpoint, but it was there, a subtle shift in the way Tama behaved around him. She was quieter, more reserved. She no longer initiated conversations the way she used to, and their intimate moments felt forced, as if she were going through the motions rather than being present with him. Rain, who had always prided himself on his ability to understand his wife, found himself increasingly confused. "Is everything okay?" Rain asked one evening as they sat down to dinner. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of concern behind his words. "You've been distant lately." Tama froze, her heart skipping a beat as she looked across the table at him. She hadn't expected him to ask, hadn't prepared for this conversation. She had been so focused on maintaining the lie, on keeping her affair with Axel a secret, that she hadn't considered how her behavior might be affecting Rain. Guilt washed over her like a tidal wave, but she forced a smile, determined to keep the truth hidden. "I'm fine," she lied, picking at her food to avoid his gaze. "Just tired. The business has been keeping me busy." Rain frowned, his eyes searching her face for a moment before he nodded slowly. "I know you've been working hard," he said, his voice gentle. "But you can talk to me, Tama. If something's bothering you, I want to help." Tama's chest tightened at his words. Rain had always been like this, understanding, patient, willing to listen. And here she was, betraying him behind his back, lying to his face, all because she couldn't let go of the excitement Axel brought into her life. She wanted to tell him the truth, to confess everything and beg for his forgiveness, but the fear of losing him, of losing the security their marriage provided, kept her silent. "I'm fine," she repeated, her voice hollow. Rain didn't push the issue, but the concern in his eyes didn't fade. He watched her closely for the rest of the evening, and for the first time in their marriage, Tama felt like she was under a microscope. Every word, every action, felt scrutinized, as if Rain was trying to piece together what was really going on. But he never asked again, and Tama breathed a small sigh of relief, knowing she had dodged a bullet. But the guilt didn't go away. In fact, it only grew stronger. Every time she was with Axel, the thrill of their encounters was followed by a crushing sense of shame. She would look at herself in the mirror after their meetings, wondering who she had become. This wasn't the woman Rain had married, wasn't the woman she had promised herself she would be. She had become someone she didn't recognize, someone who was willing to betray her husband for the sake of fleeting excitement. And yet, she couldn't stop. Axel made her feel things she hadn't felt in years. When they were together, everything else faded away, the guilt, the fear, the consequences. It was like being caught in a storm, swept up by the intensity of their connection. Every kiss, every touch, was electric, and Tama found herself craving more. She knew it was wrong, knew that what she was doing could destroy her marriage, but the pull was too strong to resist. It wasn't long before the lies began to pile up. Tama started making excuses to Rain more often, late nights at the store, meetings with suppliers, business trips that didn't exist. Rain, ever trusting, never questioned her. He believed her lies, took her at her word, and that only made Tama feel worse. The deeper she got into the affair, the harder it became to maintain the facade. She found herself slipping, forgetting small details of the lies she had told, struggling to keep her story straight. One night, after another secret meeting with Axel, Tama returned home late, the guilt weighing heavily on her shoulders. Rain was already in bed, his back to her as she slipped into the room quietly. She stood there for a moment, watching him, the man she had promised to love and honor, and the reality of what she had done hit her like a punch to the gut. She was destroying him, destroying their marriage, and for what? A few moments of excitement? A thrill that would eventually fade, leaving her with nothing but the wreckage of her life? Tama slid into bed beside Rain, careful not to wake him. But as she lay there, staring up at the ceiling, the guilt became unbearable. She wanted to tell him the truth, to end the lies, but every time she opened her mouth to speak, the words got stuck in her throat. She couldn't bring herself to admit what she had done, couldn't bear the thought of losing everything she had. So, she stayed silent. And the double life continued. Tama had been living on the edge for months. Every time she met Axel, every time she told Rain another lie, she felt the walls closing in. It was only a matter of time before the facade crumbled. She knew she couldn't keep juggling her marriage and the affair forever, but she had no idea how to stop. The thrill of being with Axel had become a part of her life, a dangerous addiction she couldn't shake. And yet, every night when she came home to Rain, the guilt threatened to swallow her whole. Rain wasn't oblivious to the changes. He wasn't the type to pry or push, but he was far from blind. The distance between them had become impossible to ignore. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the way Tama seemed distant even when she was with him, it all added up to something Rain couldn't deny. He had tried to give her space, had tried to be patient, but the nagging feeling that something was wrong had taken root. He knew his wife, and this wasn't her. One evening, after Tama came home particularly late, Rain decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. He had been rehearsing this conversation in his head for days, trying to figure out the right words to say, but now that the moment had arrived, everything felt more difficult. He sat at the kitchen table, waiting, listening to the sound of her keys in the door. When she walked in, he could see the weariness in her face, the way she avoided his gaze as she set her bag down on the counter. "Hey," Rain said quietly, his voice calm but firm. Tama froze for a moment, her heart skipping a beat as she heard the seriousness in his tone. She could feel the tension in the room, thick and heavy, and she knew exactly where this was going. The knot in her stomach tightened, her pulse quickening. She had been expecting this, dreading it, but now that it was happening, she didn't know how to face it. "Hey," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're still up?" Rain nodded, but his expression didn't soften. "We need to talk, Tama." Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned to face him, her mind racing as she tried to think of an excuse, a way out. But the look in Rain's eyes told her that there was no escaping this conversation. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. "Is something going on?" Rain asked, his voice steady but laced with pain. "You've been distant for months now. You're always working late. You barely talk to me anymore, and I feel like I don't even know you anymore. If there's something wrong, I need to know." Tama stood frozen, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had been preparing for this moment, rehearsing her lies, telling herself that she could talk her way out of it. But standing there, looking at the hurt in Rain's eyes, all of her defenses crumbled. I've been busy with the store," she stammered, her voice shaky. "You know how it is, Rain. We've been trying to expand, and there's so much going on right now." Rain shook his head, his jaw clenched. "This isn't just about the store, Tama. I'm not an idiot. Something's changed, and you're not telling me the truth." The silence in the room was deafening. Tama's mind raced as she tried to find a way to salvage the situation, but the truth was bubbling up inside her, threatening to spill out. She couldn't keep lying to him, not anymore. Rain deserved better than this. I don't know what to say," Tama whispered, her voice barely audible. Rain leaned forward, his eyes searching hers, his voice breaking with emotion. "Are you seeing someone else?" Tama felt her heart drop into her stomach. There it was, the question she had been dreading. She opened her mouth to deny it, to lie again, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't do it. The guilt, the shame, the betrayal, it was all too much. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stood there, her chest tightening with the weight of what she was about to say. I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. Rain's face fell, his worst fear confirmed. He stared at her, the pain in his eyes so raw that it made Tama's heart ache. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The truth hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Tama wanted to take it back, to make it all go away, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Rain stood up slowly, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tama wiped the tears from her face, her body shaking. "A few months," she admitted, her voice weak. "It wasn't supposed to happen, Rain. I never meant for it to get this far." Rain let out a bitter laugh, his eyes red with emotion. "You never meant for it to get this far? You've been lying to me for months, Tama. Sneaking around, betraying me, and you never thought it would get this far?" The anger in his voice hit her like a slap, and Tama flinched, her heart breaking at the sound of his pain. She had hurt him more than she ever thought possible, and there was no way to undo it. "I'm so sorry," she said again, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to hurt you." Rain shook his head, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Well, you did. You've destroyed everything, Tama. Everything we built, everything we had. It's all gone now. Tama sobbed quietly, unable to look him in the eyes. She wanted to say something, anything, to make it better, but there was nothing left to say. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. Rain stood there for a moment, his chest heaving as he tried to contain the anger and heartbreak swirling inside him. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold and detached. I want you to leave. Tama's eyes widened, her heart sinking at his words. Rain, please, she begged, her voice trembling. We can work through this. We can fix it. Rain's eyes hardened, the love and warmth that had always been there replaced by something cold and distant. There's nothing left to fix, Tama. You killed it. Tama felt the tears spill down her cheeks as Rain turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, alone in the silence of their home. She wanted to run after him, to beg for his forgiveness, but she knew it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. The confrontation had shattered their marriage beyond repair, and now, Tama had to face the reality of what she had done. The morning after the confrontation, Tama woke up in a daze, her head pounding from a restless night of sleep. The house felt different now, heavier, colder. Rain was already gone, having left early for work without saying a word. The silence in the house was suffocating, and Tama felt the weight of what had happened the night before pressing down on her like a stone. She had destroyed everything. Her hands trembled as she sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched cup of coffee. The night replayed in her mind over and over again, the pain in Rain's voice, the look in his eyes when she admitted to the affair, the way he told her to leave. His words echoed in her ears, you killed it. Tama knew there was no coming back from this. The betrayal was too deep, the trust too broken. She had lied to Rain for months, sneaking around behind his back, telling herself that she could keep both worlds separate. But now, everything had collided, and the reality of what she had done was staring her in the face. She thought about packing her things and leaving, just as Rain had asked her to, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Where would she even go? Axel? The thought of running to him felt hollow now. What had once been thrilling and exciting was now tainted by guilt and shame. Axel had been an escape, a way for her to feel alive again, but now that the fantasy was over, all she felt was emptiness. The truth was, Tama wasn't even sure what Axel meant to her anymore. What had seemed like a passionate connection now felt like a mistake, a selfish, reckless decision that had cost her everything. And deep down, she knew Axel didn't care about her the way Rain had. For Axel, this had always been casual, something fun and temporary. He had never made her any promises, and now that the affair was out in the open, she doubted he would stick around to pick up the pieces. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Axel, "Can I see you tonight?" Tama stared at the screen, her heart sinking. The temptation to run to him was still there, to lose herself in the excitement of their affair and forget about the mess she had created. But she couldn't do it. Not now. Not after everything. The thought of seeing him made her feel sick, a reminder of all the lies she had told and the marriage she had destroyed. She didn't respond. The day passed in a blur. Tama wandered aimlessly around the house, unsure of what to do with herself. She couldn't bring herself to call Rachel, couldn't bear the thought of explaining what had happened, of admitting to her best friend that she had ruined her marriage. Instead, she stayed alone with her guilt, replaying every decision that had led her to this point. When Rain finally came home that evening, the tension in the air was suffocating. He barely looked at her as he walked through the door, his expression cold and distant. He didn't say a word, just walked past her and headed straight for the bedroom. Tama sat frozen on the couch, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to say something, to apologize again, to beg him to forgive her. But the look in his eyes the night before had told her everything she needed to know. He was done. The silence between them stretched on for days. Rain came home late from work every night, barely speaking to her. When he did, it was brief and clipped, as if every word was a reminder of the betrayal. Tama tried to stay out of his way, but the tension was unbearable. She knew this wasn't sustainable. They couldn't keep living like this, in a house full of silence and resentment. One evening, as Rain sat at the kitchen table with a drink in his hand, Tama finally mustered the courage to speak. "Rain," she said softly, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." He didn't look at her, just took another sip of his drink. "What's there to talk about, Tama? You made your choice." Tama's throat tightened, and she forced herself to keep going. "I know I hurt you. I know I ruined everything, and I'm so sorry. I don't even know what I was thinking." Rain finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and anger. "You weren't thinking, Tama. That's the problem. You were too busy sneaking around with him to think about anything else." Tama's chest ached at his words. I know I messed up. But, can we at least try to talk about it? Try to fix things?" Rain stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, with a sigh, he shook his head. "There's nothing to fix, Tama. It's broken. You broke it." Tama's heart sank. She had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. Rain wasn't going to forgive her. He wasn't going to let this blow over and go back to the way things were. She had crossed the line, and there was no going back. "I'll leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "If that's what you want." Rain didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at the table in front of him. Then he nodded, his voice low. "I think that's best." Tama felt the tears welling up in her eyes as she stood from the table, her legs shaking beneath her. She had known this was coming, but the reality of it hit her like a punch to the gut. She had nowhere to go, no plan, nothing but the wreckage of her decisions. But staying here, in this house filled with broken memories, wasn't an option anymore. That night, as Rain slept in their bed, Tama quietly packed her things. She didn't take much, just a suitcase of clothes and a few personal items. The rest of it, the life she had built with Rain, she left behind. As she stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching him sleep, she felt a wave of regret wash over her. She had destroyed their life together, and for what? A few fleeting moments of excitement with Axel? It all felt so meaningless now. Tama left without saying goodbye. The next few days were a blur of numbness. Tama found herself staying in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, unable to face anyone. She didn't tell Rachel, didn't respond to Axel's messages, didn't try to make sense of the mess she had created. She was alone, truly alone, for the first time in her life. She spent hours lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every mistake in her head. How had it all gone so wrong? How had she let her curiosity, her desire for something new, destroy everything? She had been selfish, reckless, and now she was paying the price. Axel continued to reach out, but Tama ignored his calls and texts. She couldn't face him, couldn't deal with the reality of what their affair had done to her life. What had once felt like a thrilling escape now felt like a cruel joke. Axel had never loved her. He had never wanted more than a fling, and now that the excitement was over, he would move on to someone else. Meanwhile, Tama was left with nothing but the wreckage of her life. As the days passed, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She had no home, no marriage, and no clear path forward. The life she had once taken for granted was gone, and now she was left to figure out what came next. But the truth was, Tama didn't know what came next. She didn't know how to rebuild after the destruction she had caused. All she knew was that the fallout from her choices was only just beginning. Tama sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper as the weight of everything she had done slowly settled over her. It had been almost a week since she'd left the house she had shared with Rain, and yet, the reality of her situation still felt surreal. She had gone from a comfortable life, one filled with stability, love, and security, to this, a cheap room that smelled faintly of mildew, her suitcase haphazardly packed in the corner, and the overwhelming sense that she had destroyed everything good in her life. She hadn't spoken to Rain since she walked out that night. He hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't reached out at all. It was over, and she knew it. But the finality of it all hadn't really hit her until now. As much as she had prepared herself for the possibility that Rain might never forgive her, she had never truly imagined what life would be like without him. Now, as she sat in that lonely motel room, she felt the full weight of her actions pressing down on her, and it was unbearable. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and Tama glanced at it, her heart sinking when she saw Axel's name flash across the screen. She hadn't spoken to him since the night Rain found out about the affair. Axel had called and texted several times, but each time, Tama ignored him. What was there to say? The excitement, the thrill that had once drawn her to Axel, now felt empty and meaningless. She couldn't even look at his name without feeling a wave of regret and disgust wash over her. Tama let the phone buzz until it stopped. She couldn't talk to Axel, not now. Maybe not ever. She stood up slowly, pacing the small, cramped room, her mind racing with everything that had happened. How had it come to this? How had she gone from being Rain's loving wife to a woman living out of a suitcase in a dingy motel? The answers weren't simple, but they were there, lurking in the corners of her mind, reminding her of every bad decision she had made along the way. It had started with a small feeling, dissatisfaction, a yearning for something more. She had convinced herself that she wasn't hurting anyone, that her curiosity about Axel was harmless. But she had let that curiosity grow into something far more dangerous. She had allowed herself to be swept up in the excitement of it all, to lose herself in the idea of something new, something thrilling. And now, she was paying the price. Tama sat back down on the bed, her hands shaking as she buried her face in them. She had betrayed Rain, the man who had loved her unconditionally, the man who had trusted her completely. She had lied to him, over and over again, telling herself that she could keep the affair with Axel separate from her marriage. But she hadn't. The affair had seeped into every part of her life, poisoning everything it touched. She had tried to compartmentalize it, to keep her feelings for Axel in one box and her life with Rain in another, but the walls between those boxes had crumbled long ago. And now, she had nothing. Tama's chest tightened as the realization washed over her. She had destroyed her marriage for a man who had never really cared about her. Axel had been an escape, a fleeting thrill, but he had never promised her anything more. He had been charming, yes, and he had made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years, but in the end, Axel wasn't the one who had to live with the consequences of their actions. He could walk away unscathed, but Tama was left with the wreckage of her life. A bitter laugh escaped her lips as she thought about how foolish she had been. She had thrown away years of love and commitment for something so shallow, so temporary. She had convinced herself that she needed excitement, that she needed passion. But what she really needed was Rain, the man who had been by her side through everything, the man who had built a life with her, the man who had loved her even when she didn't deserve it. Tama lay back on the bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling as tears filled her eyes. She thought about the years she and Rain had spent together, the good times, the bad times, the little moments in between. She thought about the way he used to hold her when she was upset, the way he would surprise her with her favorite coffee when she was having a bad day, the way he had always believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. And she had thrown it all away. The tears flowed freely now, her sobs shaking her body as the full weight of her regret crashed over her. She had been selfish. She had been reckless. And now, she was alone. Rain was gone, Axel was meaningless, and the life she had once taken for granted was nothing but a distant memory. For the first time since the affair began, Tama truly understood what she had lost. It wasn't just the marriage, the home, or the security. It was the man who had loved her without question, the man who had stood by her through everything, the man who had trusted her when she didn't deserve it. She had lost Rain, and she would never get him back. As the tears finally began to subside, Tama felt a numbness settle over her. She didn't know what to do next, didn't know how to rebuild her life from the ashes of her decisions. All she knew was that the path she had chosen had led her here, alone, full of regret, and unsure of what the future held. The next few days passed in a blur. Tama tried to focus on practical things, finding a new place to stay, figuring out what her next steps would be, but the guilt and regret hung over her like a dark cloud. She couldn't escape it, couldn't push it away. Every thought, every memory, was a reminder of what she had lost and the damage she had caused. She thought about calling Rain, about begging for his forgiveness, but she knew it was useless. There was no going back. Rain had made it clear that their marriage was over, and she had no right to ask for a second chance after what she had done. She had broken his heart, and there was no fixing it. One evening, as she sat alone in her motel room, Tama finally made a decision. She couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the mistakes she had made, but she could at least try to learn from them. She had spent so long running from her dissatisfaction, from her fear of confronting the issues in her marriage, that she had destroyed everything in the process. But now, she had no choice but to face herself and the choices she had made. She opened her phone and blocked Axel's number. It was a small step, but it was something. She couldn't go back to him, couldn't continue to chase the excitement that had led her down this path. She needed to find a way to move forward, even if she didn't know what that looked like yet. For the first time in weeks, Tama allowed herself to feel the weight of her emotions without running from them. She had made a mess of her life, and now she had to figure out how to live with the consequences. But one thing was clear, she couldn't keep hiding from the truth. The affair with Axel had been a mistake, a terrible one, and she had to take responsibility for that. As she lay in the dark, her mind filled with the echoes of everything she had lost, Tama knew that her life would never be the same. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain, she could never make the same mistake again. Weeks had passed since Tama left Rain, and while the sting of regret hadn't faded, the numbness had begun to lift. Each day was still a struggle, figuring out where she belonged in a world where everything familiar had been shattered, but Tama was slowly starting to come to terms with her new reality. She couldn't undo what had happened, but she could try to build something from the wreckage. After leaving the motel, she had found a small, temporary apartment on the outskirts of town. It was nothing like the home she had shared with Rain, but it was a place to regroup, to figure out what came next. It was a new beginning, albeit one she never wanted. Her days were filled with quiet introspection, working at the store, trying to rebuild her routine, and grappling with the overwhelming loneliness that hung over her like a shadow. Her friends didn't know the full extent of what had happened, and Tama wasn't ready to share the details. She had barely spoken to Rachel since moving out, and although her best friend had sensed something was wrong, Tama hadn't been able to admit the full truth. She wasn't ready to confront the judgment or the pity she knew would come if she told anyone what she had done. Rain, too, remained a distant figure. He hadn't contacted her since the night she left, and she hadn't tried to reach out either. Tama couldn't blame him. She had shattered his trust, and whatever future they might have had together was gone. The thought of him moving on, finding someone else, someone who deserved him, hurt more than she wanted to admit. But she knew it was inevitable. She had made sure of that. There were days when she thought about calling him, about apologizing one last time. But each time, she stopped herself. Rain deserved to move on without her dragging him back into the pain she had caused. He had made it clear that their relationship was over, and Tama had to accept that. She had to give him the space to heal, just as she needed to heal herself. Her thoughts often drifted back to Axel, but not with the same excitement or longing as before. Now, when she thought about him, she felt only emptiness and regret. She had built up Axel in her mind, convinced herself that he could give her something that Rain couldn't, but now she saw it for what it really was, an illusion. Axel had been a temporary distraction, a way for her to escape the routine of her life, but he had never been anything more. In the weeks after the affair was exposed, Axel had tried to reach out to her, sending her messages, asking to meet. But Tama never responded. She had blocked his number, cut ties with him completely. She knew that going back to him would only drag her deeper into the mess she had created, and she couldn't afford to make the same mistakes again. Axel had already cost her too much. One afternoon, while cleaning the small apartment, Tama found herself sorting through old photographs she had hastily packed when she left Rain. Photos of their wedding day, of the vacations they had taken together, of the life they had built. Each picture was a reminder of the love they had once shared and of the trust she had shattered. She held the photos in her hands, her chest tightening as memories of happier times flooded her mind. She had thrown it all away, and now all she had were these fragments of a life she had lost. But as painful as it was to confront those memories, Tama knew she couldn't move forward without facing them. She had spent too long running, from her dissatisfaction, from her fear, from her responsibilities. And now, she had to stop. She had to own the choices she had made, and the consequences that came with them. That evening, as the sun set outside her window, Tama made a decision. She didn't know what her future would look like, but she knew she had to start rebuilding, step by step. She had to learn to live with her guilt, with her regret, and figure out how to be better. The first step came when she called Rachel. "Hey," Rachel said, her voice filled with warmth and concern. "It's been a while. How are you?" Tama hesitated for a moment, unsure of where to begin. But she knew she couldn't keep hiding. "I messed up, Rachel," she admitted quietly. "I really messed up." There was a pause on the other end, and then Rachel's voice softened. "Tama, whatever it is, we can talk about it. You don't have to do this alone." Tama felt tears prick her eyes as the weight of her isolation began to lift. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel completely alone. She had been running from the truth for so long, but now, she was ready to face it, piece by piece. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't rebuild her life in isolation. The next few weeks brought small steps toward healing. Tama threw herself into her work at the store, finding comfort in the routine and the sense of accomplishment that came with each day. She began to reconnect with friends, slowly opening up about what had happened. It wasn't easy, every conversation felt like another piece of her shame being laid bare, but it was necessary. She had to confront her mistakes if she ever wanted to move forward. The hardest part was letting go of Rain. She still thought about him constantly, wondering if he was okay, if he was happy, if he had found someone else. But each day, she told herself that his happiness was no longer her business. She had to let him go, just as he had let her go. Holding on to the hope of reconciliation would only keep her stuck in the past. As time passed, the sharp edges of her regret began to dull. The pain was still there, but it no longer consumed her. She had learned to live with it, to accept that she had made mistakes, and that those mistakes would always be a part of her story. But they didn't define her. She was still learning, still growing, still finding her way. One afternoon, as she walked through the city streets, Tama felt the weight on her chest lift just a little. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Her life wasn't what it had been, and it wasn't what she had imagined it would be, but it was hers. And she was ready to start over.